You know, David, after creating this title and graphic, it occurred to me that we could have called today's episode Has the Weather Underground Infiltrated the World's Most Powerful Law Firm? And I think the answer is maybe yes. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason. It's great to be with you. And I guess maybe the weather underground has slithered up the parapet and sticking its head over the top.
What's a parapet again?
Oh, that's, where those castles of the medieval times. So you have those, is it crenellated, where you stick your head up and you're guarded against arrows because there's a pillar to your left and pillar to the right. So it's kind of defensive mechanism. And then if you're an archer, you can pour arrows down on the enemy.
Uh-huh. They can also pour hot oil down from that. You've
Yes.
introduced me to so many terms and so many things, David. I think people watching our show are constantly educated about important topics. I didn't know anything at all about the Weather Underground before you started telling me about Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers and their role in the Students for a Democratic Society? What was the
Yeah.
original name?
Yeah, Students for a Democratic Society, where some people say some of the original students were being funded through BI British, not British, Business International out of New York. But yeah, go ahead.
No, no, I'm listening. I mean, that's Business International New York is where we get the image from today's photo collage of Barack Obama doing this bizarre calculation on a board. It's interesting. This is allegedly from a lecture he gave at the University of Chicago, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you look at it symbolically, it's about bringing down the companies and the banks and the utilities in a almighty collapse, which is basically the dream of the Weather Underground. I mean, they were Marxist-Leninists in a period when Marxist-Leninists were running the Cambridge Five spy ring.
Hmm.
And well, I've got a few, because a number of people have been telling me, David, stop changing the topic and the subject so quickly. But you know how you and I both know how difficult that is because there's so many interesting areas. So I spent a little time thinking of a snapshot for today's show about who might prove to be a very interesting victim, and I believe that to be Rosemary Smith, the switchboard operator for Sidley, Austin, Brown and Root on the 57th floor of the
Wait,
North
wait, wait,
Tower on
wait,
the
wait.
morning of 9/11.
How is Brown and Root part of it? That's the first time you've said anything to me about Brown and Root.
Well, I think there was a merger between Brown and Wood, maybe that's what it is. Sidley Austin merged with Brown and Wood, which was another law firm, right? And the combination was called Sidley Austin, Brown and Wood. And they had offices in the North Tower, for the which uh, little Rosemary Smith was the switchboard operator. And I'll come back to her in a minute. Uh, and the other little mnemonic, I guess you could say, is I've thought of the phrase the Cambridge Five, the Oxford 10, and the Rico 3. So many of the listeners have probably heard of the Cambridge Five, which was the spy ring of alumni of Cambridge University, where you and I were in January of this year. And I think we had a fascinating trip. But these people were very smart, very cunning, and had totally penetrated the Five Eyes signals intelligence network, right? Now, many people disagree about who the five were, and Guy Burgess was accepted as one of them, Anthony Blunt as another. But I think the fifth man, the most important fifth man in that equation, was Victor Rothschild, the late Victor Rothschild, right? Obviously, a man of huge influence, particularly in setting up, for example, the CIA out of the ashes of the OSS, right? So Victor Rothschild was in Paris at the end of the war, 1945. The OSS was spawned out of the Special Operations Executive, which were operating behind enemy lines. And I think we can take a path from Victor Rothschild right through, although he died in 1990, to the outbreak of the coronavirus and the corona pandemic. And that journey takes us through Porton Down, which is the Salisbury research facility for the Ministry of Defence. But anyway, so I'm thinking Cambridge 5, Oxford 10, and I'll come to Bill Clinton's perhaps as founder role there. And the RICO 3 would be where I think the United States should go if they want to stop this pandemic scam by taking or adding to the defenses or the attack on Huawei, which is being accused of running
let
a
me pause you
RICO.
for a second, David, because at the risk of being presumptuous, I think what some people might be referring to with the changing of the subjects is that you've got so many points that you want to get across that sometimes I might pose a question, and if it's not the immediate point that you want to get across, it just sort of gets pushed aside and we start talking about something else. But what I'm trying to do is...
Channel me, Jason, channel me.
What I'm trying to do is direct the conversation towards some topics that I know you're very familiar with and our regular listeners are very familiar with. Certainly our sponsors who are enjoying the weekly sponsor-exclusive shows on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. They're familiar, but we've got so many new viewers coming in light of this coronavirus outbreak that has everybody stuck inside their homes looking for answers. I wanted to just go back over some of the information about the Weather Underground, the Sidley Austin law firm, and some of the amazing connections that you've pointed out to me that link these two things. The Weather Underground, of course, was a violent anti-war Marxist group that in the 1960s, basically they were terrorists, weren't they, David? They were bombing locations and things like that. Let's just first lay out for everyone why we make this allegation that there's a connection between some dangerous, unprosecuted terrorists and one of the most prestigious and powerful law firms in the entire world.
Yeah, sure. So Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, I believe, were instrumental in putting together the 1968 Days of Rage in Chicago that was violent, a lot of damage, property damage and that sort of thing. Of course, they loved that. But then they went on the run. And in the 1970s, they executed a series of bombing, which included the bombing of the women's washroom in the Pentagon. I think that was in 1972. And so these people, I would argue, they're psychopaths. They're loved by the left, of course, but they're extremely dangerous. And I believe in the 1970s they may have flown to Cuba to chat up with Fidel Castro.
Really?
But then in the 1970s they emerged. I believe Bernardine Dawn spent 7 months in jail because she refused to reveal the details of one of the women that were killed or blew herself up in that, was it the Greenwich bombing or the fire bombing?
Greenwich Village?
Yeah, something like that. And then they go on into the 1980s and they get, it's not a word, respectabilized, if you will, because they're embraced by universities. And in 1987, I believe, Bernardine Dawn was invited into the Sidley Austin law firm, which is one of the most powerful, possibly one of the most dangerous law firms in the world, that was originally established in 1866, the year after the end of the Civil War. And one of the first clients of Sidley Austin, it wasn't called Sidley Austin then, I forget what it was called, but anyway, it's a material. They were the founders. And one of the first clients of Sidley Austin in the 1866 period plus was Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of the assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. And I've been digging a little bit around her story. Apparently she was depressed. She was something of a profligate spender. So when Abraham Lincoln was president, she was throwing balls in the White House and basically was quite extravagant, that was looked down upon. Anyway, that's by the by. She was prone to depression. But I found a little clue that might be relevant fast forward to the assassination of JFK, where it said that she forced Abraham Lincoln to go to the Ford Theater, even though another couple, whose name I forget, was supposed to go with them. And it looks to me, or there's just a whiff of maybe she was being blackmailed or extorted to set up Abraham Lincoln so he could be assassinated in the Ford Theater,
If
which
I
would
could
be very
interject,
interesting.
David, there's a third possibility. She could simply be socially engineered to do that. Someone convinces her there's a compelling reason to go, makes her want to do it. She doesn't necessarily know the plan, not a witting participant in the plan, but I have found this to be a hallmark of social engineering. They want a mark who is unaware that they're part of the plan, but that
Hello?
person can be pivotal in the plan. Whoop. Uh-oh. Connection interrupted. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I
David?
can.
Okay.
Yes.
What I was saying is there's a third possibility that Mary Todd Lincoln and some of these other people that we're talking about, including the Sidley Austin law firm, could be being socially engineered. They're not necessarily directly threatened or blackmailed, but they're being tricked into doing something. This seems to be the way that social engineers like to do things, to get people involved in schemes where the person who's the patsy doesn't even know that they're involved until it's too late. Then they're in jail or they've been killed or whatever.
Yes, and I think the social engineers have a big spread of techniques, including threatening blackmail and extortion,
Yes.
with which Bernardine Dawn would be familiar. But we shouldn't exclude that they use torture if they can't find another method of getting you or me to do what they want. So they've
I
got the
think we
full
should
range of
also,
things.
sorry to interrupt again, David, but I think we should also consider that the use of law firms and lawsuits is another way that social engineers are persuading people to do things. I think in part because that gives whatever they're doing a cloak of official process and respectability. So it seems that law firms and lawyers willing to engage in social engineering are a critical part of their plan.
Oh, absolutely. And what is germane to that, of course, is the social engineers need an advanced technology network to communicate amongst themselves without the knowledge of their targets or the patsies or the victims, right? Whether they're going to be assassinated or extorted or blackmailed and so on. So this goes hand in hand, and this comes back to my passion for investigating the patent office to see if the signature of the crime, the extortion, the blackmail, or the murder, is conforms to what the technology or the patented technology was available at that time. So back in 1865, including I think the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, the people who went after him, the alleged assassin, and he probably was the assassin that killed Abraham Lincoln, were supposedly using the telegraph system to track him down. John Wilkes Booth ended up in a cabin, and a guy called Boston Corbett, right, who was part of the platoon or the squadron or whatever it was that was out to get him, was supposedly going to bring him back alive, because obviously with people like that, you want to quiz them and find out, was it a conspiracy or was he a loner,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a guy called Boston Corbett, who had a problem, apparently a sexual problem, because he cut his testicles off with the rusty scissors
Ooh,
because he didn't like getting into the vicinity of prostitutes and getting an erection. I mean, I'm not responsible for this. This is apparently the history.
right.
So the guy, he comes into the country around 6 years old, I believe, and he's part of this. And he creeps beside this cabin where John Wilkes Booth is holed up, and he shoots him. So no more John Wilkes Booth. But on the body, and I'm going to introduce this term that I've just got familiar with a little bit, called the long con, which is basically this is a con which takes a long time to put together because you need lots of people to participate in various roles to fool the target. So this is a long con
Mm.
that may stretch back to 1865, where Boston Corbett shoots John Wilkes Booth, but on his body they find something very interesting. They find a draft on the Bank of Canada for £100. And apparently, John Wilkes Booth was in Montreal earlier that year, right? And presumably, maybe through the Confederate spies, they gave him £100. Ultimately, we don't know, to basically take out Abraham Lincoln, which required a setup. That is to say, he had to be in the right place at the right time to kill the man. And it's just possible that Mary Todd Lincoln set the husband up by mistake or whatever it was. Anyway, she went into a terrible depression after that. I think she genuinely, obviously, well, I assume she loved her husband, right? And then through, I believe, Sidley Austin, she managed to get a pension from the American government of, I think, $5,000 a year, which set her up, until she died. Over to you.
Well, these pensions are another area that we're going to focus on today, David, but thank you for that explanation of the origins of Sidley Austin, and people can read more about that on Sidley Austin's own website. So when we flash forward to the 1960s, where Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn were busily, protesting the United States war in Vietnam, and the United States government in general, their stated goal was to destroy the United States, to overthrow the government, and to put in place a democratic socialist society that presumably they would sit on top of or somehow be elites in. We've also spoken in the past, David, about this article that appeared in the New York Times on September 11th, 2001. This was an article that was put there. They were interviewing Bill Ayers about the release of his memoir of sorts, as they call it. This was published on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, and you and I have spoken many times about how obviously the New York Times is printed prior to 8 a.m., and the planes began hitting their targets at, I think, 8:04 or 8:40 or something like that. So the fact that this appeared in the New York Times and the headline states, "No regrets for a love of explosives," the first quote from Bill Ayers himself says that he doesn't regret setting off bombs. In fact, he feels that they didn't do enough. In my mind, David, this article, the timing that it's posted, and the statements made by Ayers are at least suggestive of foreknowledge of the incident and, of course, destroying the economy, turning us into socialists, imprisoning everyone who can't be re-educated. That was their goal, and it seems to be remarkably similar to what we are all living out right now for the past 2 months.
Oh, it's absolutely astonishing how this thread goes on. So let's just go back to they're on the run in the 1970s. I think Bernadine Dawn gets 7 months in jail because she doesn't reveal what she knew about the woman who I think got blown up or blew herself up in Greenwich Village. But the 1980s is really interesting because in 1987, to the best of my knowledge, Bernadine Dawn is imported into Sidley Austin. She's not allowed to practice law because of her record, but she seems to serve as a mentor for Michelle LaVaughn Robinson, who would go on to marry Barack Hussein Obama, or Barry Soetoro, as he might well have been known then, right? And eventually become the first lady with Barry Soetoro or Barack Hussein Obama in the White House. And this is where, well, I don't say America's problems begin, but they certainly have reached a level where it's perfectly reasonable to assume that the weathermen have got what they wanted, which
Yeah.
is the destruction of the United States government.
Now, David, let me
And what
just
they
ask you a question real quickly here. And also, I want to point out that, this Barry Soetoro, Barack Obama, another hallmark of a social engineer is that they're frequently using alternative names. Do we know how Barry Soetoro came to use the name Barack Obama? Where does that all come from?
well, as I understand it, Barry Soetoro is his stepfather after his mother moved off and into, I think, Indonesia and met, I think he was a government functionary, the Soetoro. And so Barack was the stepson and took the name of the stepfather, right? And then he calls himself Obama. Now, I'm not quite sure actually where the Obama came from, right? But either way, when he gets into that Sidley Austin environment, he now has the woman he's going to marry, which is Michelle LaVaughn Robinson, being groomed and mentored by a genocidal psychopath.
And how do we
in
know
my opinion.
that? Where did we get that piece of data from, that Bernardine Dorn was the mentor of Michelle Obama? Because this is
Well, it's
important, and for people who are,
multiple references. In 1987, I think Michelle LaVaughn Robinson was hired in 1988. She had a number of contracts. So they were working together, right? And as my understanding is, they were good friends and entertained at each other's houses, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's in various documents, independent documents. I don't think it's disputed that they knew each other extremely well, right? And Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn supported Obama's election campaign. So in 1991, I think you have they two get married. I believe that's the year they got married, right? But like you phrase, they're together from the beginning, right? So what happened to the culture, the Marxist-Leninist mindset of Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, where when asked by that Larry Graswell, I think it is his name, who's an FBI mole that got inside the Students for a Democratic Society and the Weather Underground, he asked them, well, what are you going to do if your revolution is successful to preserve the revolution? And they said, well, we'll have to re-educate people. This is Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. And we may have to eliminate 25 million Americans. So you've got the mentor of Michelle Obama considering what will be necessary to protect the revolution that the United States is looking at, Jason, right now.
yep.
Now, when we're talking about the kinds of dead that might need to protect their revolution, why wouldn't I assume that the Event 201 exercise, co-hosted by Johns Hopkins University and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the Pierre Hotel on October the 19th of last year, they talked about a pandemic with 65 million dead, right? So I think, was it Stalin said, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. These people are psychopaths,
Wow.
right? 65 million dead. Now, the way they're playing it, and I don't know if you want to go down that channel and talk about the cat bond stuff, the way they're playing it, they've structured a simulation of the spread of this virus that is generating deaths that are being attributed to COVID-19. But the way the simulations are structured and programmed using artificial intelligence, they can generate any number of false positives and any number of false negatives, such that they create the perception through the media of the number of people that have died in, for example, the United States as a result of COVID-19, but they haven't proved that the people who are dying from COVID-19.
Now, David, I have to pause you there for a second because you've said one of the most important things in my mind, this concept of a simulation to cause people to believe that many more people are dying than perhaps they actually are. Dr. Colleen Smith, who's pictured here in this tweet from the New York Times, in her own resume tells us that she's a simulation expert. And if we look her up on LinkedIn, Dr. Colleen Smith also tells us that she's an alumni of the University of Chicago. And this is very important because Bernardine Dorn is also an alumni.
That's right. And she's on faculty. She was on faculty at the Northwestern University, which was the first target for the Unabomber. But I digress. There's someone else who's an expert on simulation, and you're talking to him, Jason.
But
Right?
wait a minute.
Because
Before we get off of this, David, I think it's important that we discuss these University of Chicago connections because we also know that Michelle Obama had a variety of different roles at the University of Chicago. She was the Associate Dean of Students, and then later she had some job related to the University of Chicago Medical Center. I wonder if an undergraduate aspiring medical student might have had some contact with Michelle Obama. It's certainly interesting to note that Dr. Colleen Smith has refused to answer questions about her time at the University of Chicago. She's refused to answer questions about whether or not she's ever interacted with or met Bernardine Dorn or Michelle Obama. And there's also a New York City councilman, guy by the name of Brad Lander, who also went to the University of Chicago, David. And this is a guy who has been accused by Michael Moore, editor of True Pundit, of manipulating COVID-19 death statistics in New York, particularly in New York City, where he's done things like attributing cancer deaths to COVID-19 on the logical basis that if the hospitals were not overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients, this person might not have died of cancer. So this guy went to the University of Chicago, and looking at his age, it might have been right around the same time that Michelle Obama was there. He's super into equality and a lot of the things that we see some of these left-leaning organizations support. His wife, Brad Lander, I'm talking about right now, is an executive vice president at Planned Parenthood, which is affiliated, at least loosely, with Bill Gates. I believe his mother or his father had something to do with the founding of his mother had something to do with the founding of Planned Parenthood. So there's all these people that are connected to each other, that are connected to the University of Chicago, that could be connected to the Weather Underground or a modern iteration of it that could have infiltrated Sidley Austin without the good people at Sidley Austin even being aware. But Bernardine Dohrn, Michelle Obama, and Barack Obama seem to have a lot of influence over Sidley Austin, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're talking about here is they can deny having face-to-face contact with someone, but with these social networks, it's all being digitalized. So the number of contacts that are available to these people instantly through social networking is nearly infinite. So basically, I think you can do 5 handshakes through a social network and you're everywhere in the world, including Kim Jong-un, the dictator in North Korea. So they're being, I think, disingenuous. And maybe, can I just come into the technology of how a social network might be set up and who, perhaps unwittingly, would have been key to setting up the kinds of networks that I believe are spreading the fake news and simulated data on COVID-19, which has put the world into a panic where we're now all supposed to maintain a distance of 6 feet between each other. And they're shutting down hundreds of thousands or millions of small businesses. And the United States of America is entering a tunnel, and it may not come out at the other end in anything like it enters that tunnel, unless, to be put it bluntly, I claim, people like you and I and the people you interview are able to communicate with clarity, and that's a huge challenge, a very complex long con, which is a con that started back certainly in the 50s, at the end of the Cambridge Five, went through the period when the Weather Underground was blowing buildings up through the 70s, I think through the period when the Unabomber was killing people, right? And allegedly that was attributed to Ted Kaczynski, right? Right through the 70s and the 80s to the 90s, when an extraordinary step took place that I think I've just discovered. The Director General of the BBC, up to the period of 2000, when it was taken over by Greg Dyke, who's a friend of mine, is a guy called John Burt. And in 1998, the BBC took out a patent, right, which I believe is the cornerstone of these fake news injects into social networks. And that patent is called a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. You and I have gone over it multiple times. And you and I think it provoked very early on a question from you about why are they generating television signals and why aren't they focused on what the newsreader is reading from the prompt? I mean, that would seem to be the principal goal of this tool. Through the research I've been doing, and I think what we've discovered, I believe the generation of television signals are the vectors that trigger a bomb or an assassination or the removal of evidence from a crime scene. And it's essentially a key ingredient to these catastrophe bond frauds that I believe brought the Twin Towers down on 9/11. So John Burt, in 1998, he either knew or he ought to have known that the BBC had done something really extraordinary. It had created a system to discreetly inject fake news into the global media. Now, that matters for America, it matters for Canada, it matters for the United Kingdom and Australia and New Zealand, the Five Eyes countries, because BBC is the world's biggest broadcaster of entertainment, news, and propaganda, and has been since the 1920s. And when on the outside of Broadcasting House we have that statue by Eric Gill, which is a sexualized, naked boy crucified Christ, serenaded by a couple of angels, I assume they're angels, and one of those angels is holding a book to his private parts, the young boy.
Whoop, David, you there still? It's telling us connection lost. David, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we're back.
Yes, just as you were about to tell us about Absculta.
Yeah, now whether that's a coincidence or not, but thanks to one of our listeners, they told us that Absculta is the first word in the Benedictine Creed, which means listen and obey. So this is the world's leading, biggest broadcaster of news, entertainment, and propaganda that is basically telling you and telling me and telling Donald Trump and telling Americans and anyone else who cares to listen, well, even if you don't care to listen, essentially the BBC is now propagating a dystopic vision of the world where the peasants, the citizens, have nothing to do other than listen and obey, like stay 6 feet apart, do not assemble in groups, do not protest in Hong Kong, right? And if you don't listen and you don't obey, we're going to kill you, whether it's with bombs or biological weapons like this virus. So there's an unmistakable message of tyranny coming through a channel of Marxist Leninists, which were the Cambridge Five, through the Weathermen, right up to the present, where many people, I've seen statements like Michelle Obama has star power and Biden would select her as a running mate at a drop of a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Well, I suggest that Americans think very carefully before letting Biden select Michelle Obama as his running mate, because you might end up one day with the progeny of the weatherman running your country. Over to you.
We've already had that in her husband. You're talking, David, of course, about the BBC Broadcasting House, where you and I visited on our trip to London. People who are sponsors of the show have been able to see that. People who are hearing about this for the first time can go back in the archives of the sponsored shows. They can join us on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, I would have to say that anybody who's been the Director General of the BBC, sadly up to and including your friend Greg Dyke, who have not addressed this very disturbing statue of an adult man anally raping a naked young boy, which there was a public outcry to remove this thing, I think in 2012, and nothing was done. So it's not a mystery. I mean, everybody basically knows that the BBC was the longtime home of Jimmy Savile, one of the most prolific pedophiles and weirdos of all time. We've been talking a lot on Crowdsource the Truth about what's his name? Jeffrey Epstein and his entrapment network that seems to have involved former U.S. President Bill Clinton and all kinds of really unspeakable acts. We've recently been told about this guy, Peter Nygaard, who seems to have a lot of similar accusations leveled against him as those that people have brought against Jeffrey Epstein. These things seem to be elements of evidence that various intelligence agencies are actively involved in this type of rape, torture, and entrapping people who engage in that or witness that. They basically want to, trick people into these or get willing people. But once you're in these pedophile entrapment activities that have involved snuff films, you've spoken to us about StarNet Communications, how there was a raid in 1999 at 425 Carroll Street. A lot of these things, David, seem to come together when we look at that company Phantom Secure that was modifying the hardware of BlackBerry phones, also a Canadian technology developed by the company Research in Motion. This Phantom Secure is a company that the FBI must have been investigating in 2015, 2016, 2017, because they provided a press release in 2018 stating that they had busted Phantom Secure. You and I have linked this symbol of the Thunderbird, which we're told is a warning, to symbology that's been associated with Bernardine Dorn and others. I mean, again, this is not the type of evidence that we could necessarily bring into a court and consider this case closed, but it's certainly fascinating to observe, and it leads to more questions. It leads to additional hypotheses and could help us find the answers to some of these questions. Just remarkable similarity in the symbology.
Yeah, absolutely. And that statue of the man, the bearded man, holding a naked boy to his thighs, if you will, you notice they're standing on a globe, right? So to me, the transmission of that signal and the sculpture by Eric Gill by the BBC says, directly or indirectly, a homosexual pedophile relationship rules the world, right? And your heading today, we're talking about basically the control of the world through these odd structures where symbology and fear and entrapment and blackmail rule the day. Now, what are we looking at here with this BBC? We're looking at a city. You and I got inside the building. We weren't allowed to film in the building, right? But let's talk a little bit about the upgrade to the BBC studios. And I just want to remind the audience that the BBC is the world's largest broadcaster by employer or payroll. And basically, it can do that because it's not competing in the media, with other channels, CNN or Fox News or whatever it is. The television license fee that is paid by everyone with the television in the United Kingdom goes into the BBC to fund its spectrum of news, entertainment, and propaganda. And that's in the billions of pounds, right? Which means that they can have their correspondents all around the world. And they've got the technology that was upgraded by a British company called Bovis, which had a number of interesting contracts in the United States. Bovis got the job to build the 911 memorial, where they put two enormous holes in the ground and took away all of the evidence of the incendiaries that brought the towers down. And Bovis built the Trump Hotel in Chicago, a concrete building, and the Trump Hotel in Soho in New York. In July of 2001, Nortel outsourced installation work to a number of companies, including AMEC and Bovis. And AMEC ran the business above 425 Carroll Street, where StarNet, over 4 years, built a global operation for hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming. It's reasonable to suppose that AMEC actually installed the network and software that was confiscated in August of 1999 that allowed the StarNet criminal network that was into 60 countries, as I said, engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography. So that kit was confiscated. I allege, and I think we'll find that StarNet went online and used those Phantom Secure modified BlackBerry phones to maintain operations right through to the present. And when the RCMP and the FBI and the Australian police allegedly rolled up Phantom Secure, I don't think they did roll it up, because remember, they're supporting 20,000 criminals around the world. And I believe, Jason, many of those criminals would be in jail, because
David,
that's where you get
pause
the
you
best
here,
alibi.
because you've just caused me to think of something. And, some people say we're talking about this again and again, but this is such a complicated subject and it remains unsolved. you've said that it went online. Nowadays, I mean, that's such a vague term. Everything is online. Everyone is online everywhere. You've got your phone, you're constantly online. I think a more accurate statement might be that it became decentralized because this connected world of everybody being online means instead of having a centralized location like 425 Carroll Street, where they were, not only making these productions, they had the computer hardware, they were bringing the individuals who were subjected to these pornographic videos that were being made. We've speculated that it may have involved, torturing and killing these people, that they would be snuff films. What about the concept, David, that instead of it going online, Starnet Communications realized it had to become decentralized to protect itself? And perhaps...
I lost you.
Oops. David, you back? David? It's interesting. Are you back, David?
Okay. Yep, okay. Back.
I'm just running down this possibility that Starnet Communications may have become decentralized rather than saying that it went online. I mean, it was always online. They were delivering these videos over the internet to more than 60 countries around the world. But if it became decentralized, like if the data center were at Cameron Ordis's house, or it could be anywhere, perhaps it went onto Jeffrey Epstein's jet, the Lolita Express, which we know was decked out on the interior and probably had, rooms equipped with video cameras. We know that Epstein was video recording everything. We've identified that James Patterson's book, Filthy Rich, seems to think that Jeffrey Epstein has a trading floor on the jet, but Charles Ortel has told us there's no records at all of Jeffrey Epstein doing any trades whatsoever. So it's possible that James Patterson might have observed a computer data center that Epstein explained away by saying that's the trading floor, when in fact it could have been a data center utilized for recording and transmitting live snuff films. I suggest this, David, because we've recently identified that Peter Nygaard, another guy who's been accused of rape and all kinds of entrapment schemes involving offering young women modeling jobs and overwhelming them with his wealth and things like that. Peter Nygaard also flies a 50-year-old 727 jet. And I find this very strange for these super rich guys to fly 50-year-old jets, particularly the least common Boeing jet ever manufactured, when they could just as easily buy a 737, have a much easier time acquiring parts and mechanics all around the world, wherever they might go. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that both guys would use this jet unless there's something about it that makes it specially equipped for doing the types of things we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, like phantom secure, drug trafficking, murder. You can throw someone out of the back of that rear door. But let me just back up here, because I think this is really interesting. If you take what happened to Starnet with that raid of August 1999, all of the kit was taken away. I'm assuming, until it's proven otherwise, that was Nortel networking, fiber optic and wireless, installed by AMEC and Bovis in a variety of places around the world, including quite possibly on this Boeing 727.
Right.
But the AMEC and Bovis appear to have upgraded the BBC studios, right? And of course, that's the greatest concentration of, I think, BBC studios in the world. But that is serving this global audience of 500 million people, a weekly audience of 500 million people, and they can inject news, fake news, and false data using this spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals, which might be getting the public to believe that the COVID-19 virus is being spread from, let's say, China, when in fact it was planted, possibly in Wuhan City, and then planted in New York, right?
Now, David, I have two very interesting things to share with you based on what you're saying there. The first one has just come to me here. BBC News article saying Wood Group and AMEC merger plans approved. Now, weren't you just telling us about Wood something joining
Yeah,
with Sidley
different
Austin?
wood, I think. It's different wood, isn't it? It's a
Wood
common name.
Group,
Different wood.
though, but
Yeah,
who? That's interesting. We should look into that further. And then the
yeah.
other thing I wanted to share with you was the Economist article here that's telling us that the BBC is having a good pandemic.
I bet they are.
The loss of young audiences poses a mortal threat to its funding. So if you don't own a TV in England, David, do you still have to pay that TV tax?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But it's a lot of money, right? Because it's a big audience, and
But
whether
in other
it's
words, if you're a young audience and you're watching all your TV on a phone, is that TV
yeah,
tax applied to a mobile phone?
that I don't know. But I just want to extend the logic of John Burt, the former Director General of the BBC before Greg Dyke, my buddy, who joined at 2000. So John Burt introduced, knowingly or wittingly or unwittingly, the technology of the spoken text display apparatus, which was patented, or the patent was applied for, on the 3rd of August of 1998, 4 days before my birthday and 4 days before the nearly simultaneous attacks, right, on the United States Embassy in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, where a lot of Americans were killed,
Mm.
right? And it was nearly simultaneous. The BBC has made a video about the terrorist attack in Nairobi. I think it's relatively recent. What intrigues me, if I've got the right word, is the level of granularity and detail of naming names, which indicates to me the BBC knows more about who put the attack together on the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam embassies than anyone in American intelligence, which of course is ridiculous. Right? Moving forward, right? If we look at the Twin Towers, those were two extraordinary events that somehow or other, to me, were obviously synchronized. Right? Never before had a steel frame building collapsed through fire. So, shall I just touch on this
Well, before
cat
we do,
bond
David,
stuff?
because we're
Okay.
almost out of time, it's interesting to note that this reconstruction of the U.S. Embassy Nairobi attack, Age of Terror, it's created by BBC Studios, which is a for-profit
Yeah.
offshoot
Yeah.
of BBC, not funded by this television tax. And this is a good point, actually, to let people know. This is kind of a lead in to our sponsor exclusive segment that people can watch in just about 15 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. We're going to be focusing there on these double black swan event catastrophe bonds and how a fraud related to that could be executed if the right people were involved and the mark were a patsy who had no idea that they were involved in this type of social engineering con.
Absolutely. And that would bring us to the SERCO shareholders who met on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11. And amongst those shareholders, there were five patsies, if you will, in my opinion, who either didn't know or were too terrified to speak out that they were about to be taken for a ride. There were three countries, right? Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom governments. And there were two big pension funds, the pension funds that would presumably have some kind of liability for people who'd been on faculty in the United States, which would include Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, Hillary and Bill Clinton, right, and Michelle and Barack Obama. So those six people, right, would have an interest in the investment strategy of the pension fund TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which is one of the shareholders of SERCO that would have met on the 47th floor of the North Tower. The other shareholder, or the other pension fund shareholder, is the University Superannuation Scheme of the United Kingdom, which has £65 billion of assets under management. What I'm saying to the listeners, Jason, is this would be a very good way of throttling or choking or suffocating or frightening the academic community that might otherwise tell you or explain to listeners this pandemic generated by a simulation is a scam. I'm not saying there isn't a virus. I am saying that the virus that is being simulated is an engineered virus that has very specific impact on the human body, including mild symptoms, but that gets into the lungs of the elderly, and it's targeted particularly at the elderly, right? So when I talk about the patents, the Oxford 10, I'm talking about the 10 patents on my template, the first one of which is the BBC patent for a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. And I believe the television signals that are being generated are being used to trigger catastrophe bombs that brought down the two towers, right, that resulted in the disappearance of MH17 and MH370 and the crashes of the two Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft. And it is a weapon by which maybe the progeny of the weathermen seek to control society. They're creating catastrophic bonds that result in large numbers of death, possibly millions of deaths, using the culture of listen and obey and very sophisticated frauds on international networks that have been patented or in the custody of Huawei, which is the Chinese company that's facing a RICO charge.
Now, wait a minute. Before you unload the entire explanation, which is going to take a lot more time to get into, you've just hit on the key thing. We're certainly not saying that they are involved in a fraud. We're merely asking the question, with all of these different people that we've identified, Bernardine Dorn, the people connected to the University of Chicago, whether it be Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, this doctor who's featured in the New York Times. We forgot to remind everyone that the CEO of the New York Times presently is Mark Thompson, another former Director General of the BBC who failed to take that statue down or to pursue any kind of investigation into Jimmy Savile. We also should talk about this guy. I think his name is Roger Ferguson, who is the CEO of TIAA-CREF. And just in the time that we've been speaking, I've realized from Roger Ferguson's own website here that TIAA is not only the leading provider of retirement services for academics, it's also for medical. So what does that say with regard to Dr. Colleen Smith, Dr. Cameron Kyle Sidley, some of these doctors who have behaved in ways that are very inconsistent with other medical professionals, certainly with regard to their actions on social networks that you and I have been discussing. But David, we're out of time now. We're going to continue this conversation and go into much greater depth on our sponsor exclusive segment, which is starting in just a little more than 5 minutes on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to thank in advance, David, the generous sponsors that make this show possible. And I hope that people will join us over there. This is a method that I've devised to decentralize this news service. We don't have a centralized corporate sponsor or some billionaire owner. There is no one who sits on top of this news organization deciding what we can and cannot talk about. The sponsors are the viewers, and that ensures them that there's no undue economic influence from some outside force that may not like what we're talking about. And it's important that people help us carry on with that. So I hope they will become sponsors. And it's critically important that people who watch on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth also visit David's page at patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards. For people who would prefer to not join us over there, you can continue to research David's work by going to his free website, reverse-CSIscripts.com. You can download his free template and you can study the patents that David has identified in these licensed vector analyses. David, I look forward to our continued conversation, and I'll see you in just a few minutes on Patreon and Subscribestar.
Thank you very much, Jason. Bye now.
See everybody over there. Thanks for watching.